Good morning, everyone. I have to start my timer, otherwise they have to get the hook. So let me go ahead and do that. Well, it's nice to see you. I'm very appreciative of your coming out this morning, and given that this is a Wednesday morning, you had to get here by about 7:30, and it was 21 degrees. I think that only speaks to your intrepid spirits or your love of breakfast. I'm not sure which, but regardless of what it is, I'm happy that you're here. So our topic today is depression in the workplace. And what I'd like to start off with is for you just for a moment to think about how many of you would say that on occasion your mental health and personal concerns have interfered or rolled over in your day-to-day work lives. Could I just see a show of hands? All right, if you just look around, I know we're all going. I'll put mine up there because it just happens, doesn't it? So I want you to think to those times and think about what was it? Not the topic, not what motivated it, but what was the result? Were you de-energized? Were you unfocused? Did you have difficulty completing tasks? Were you indecisive? Were you withdrawn? Were you a little hypersensitive? Were you any of those things? So if you can capture in your mind's eye what that looked like, what that felt like, just for a moment, and imagine subsequent days of experiencing that. And of course, I'm assuming that this was short term, but it could have possibly been long term. What do you think the repercussions of that would be in a workplace setting? Would it be possible that if you're withdrawn, that your peers begin to withdraw from you? Would it be possible that your manager notices the difference in your work performance? Would it be possible that you begin to challenge your own way of thinking about yourself, that your self-esteem suffers? Would all of that be possible? And what I would say to you is if you can have a sense of what that would feel like, then you probably have a fairly good sense of what being depressed and being employed and not necessarily feeling safe within your work environment feels like. You would have a sense that perhaps there's a bit of shame that attaches itself, and not even necessarily from outside ourselves, but also from within ourselves, because we live in a culture where mental illness, where depression has a lot of myth and misperception about what causes it, about the people who have it. And that's our challenge here in the workplace, because we've truly been reluctant to open up that conversation. So, here's my clicker. You are in good company. More than 90% of employees agree that their mental health and personal concerns do roll over into their work and have a direct impact on their performance. The other piece with the big picture is that we lose a lot of time, attributable not only to absenteeism, which only accounts for about 1/3 of that 27.2 workdays, but presenteeism, because we show up. We show up and we give it our best effort. We try to do the job that we were hired to do. Some days we do it better than others, and some days we have trouble getting out of bed and even getting there. And so presenteeism becomes a very costly factor in this. We oftentimes just think about absenteeism. We oftentimes think about simply perhaps short-term disability or accommodations and how difficult that is and what a pain in the butt that is. But the reality is that oftentimes the person who's experiencing depression continues to move on, continues to try to get to work, thinking and waking each day, maybe, today will be different. Today I can get it together. Today I'll be able to do this. And because there are so many other signs that go along with depression other than mood and the softer signs, there are physiological signs, and oftentimes people think, well, it's not really depression, it's something else. And so we end up doing all these self-diagnosing and lose a lot of time in the idea of getting better because we don't necessarily seek out treatment. So in 2013, about and this was a Gallup poll, about an average of 12% of all workers nationwide stated they'd been diagnosed with depression, and only half of those stated that they were in treatment. Now, what you'll see are the numbers really run the gamut. You can have about 5% to even up to 23% of people reporting that they have depression. And so it's hard to get your arms around. Some of it's because we're talking about people who have been diagnosed. Other times we're talking about people who have self-diagnosed. And so you'll see this range. But regardless of what the low-level number is, which is around 5%, that 5% is very high impact. Also in 2013, 270 Americans died by suicide in the workplace, which has been an increase. And I'm talking about in the workplace, not just died by suicide, but in the workplace. So ultimately, this is probably the great fear. And this is the high impact fear that most workplaces deal with. Because if you think about what suicide does in the workplace, it's like an emotional tsunami. Regardless of whether the person completes suicide in the workplace or outside of the workplace, the effects continue on. Liz and I were doing a training last month for a pharmaceuticals, or 2 months ago, for a pharmaceuticals company. And it was their human resource team, and they mentioned that they had had a suicide in the workplace 1 year ago. And that to that day that we spoke with them, it was still talked about. There was still a level of blaming that went around in the workplace because it left people at loose ends. The woman who died by suicide had gone out with her team the night before, had drinks with them, seemed fine to them, and obviously they were baffled by this. And so when you think about this, suicide is the third leading cause of death in the world. Within the working population, it's the fourth leading cause of death for ages 18 to 65, the fourth leading cause of death. Fortunately, I'll give you good news. Now you're probably saying, why did I come here to this morning? This is so depressing. But I'm actually going to give you the good news. The good news is that Connecticut has one of the lowest suicide rates in the country. So there are 5 states with really low suicide rates, and Connecticut is one of them. About 10 people for every 100,000. So Connecticut's doing something right here. The employee perspective. So how is it that employees see this whole topic of depression? What's their lived experience? So what you'll find is in this IDEA survey, which was the Impact of Depression at Work survey, that 23% of respondents indicated they've been diagnosed with depression in their lifetime. And as you know, or perhaps don't know, there's a disproportionate number of people with depression in the workplace because of the age of onset is later. And so in their lifetime definitely means that they're probably within those working years. 40% of respondents indicated taking time off work an average of 10 days per year. So you can see how that fits into the 1/3 of the 27 days approximately. And then 58% reported not telling their employer about their diagnosis. Now that statement in and of itself doesn't sound like a big deal, but I want you to think about for a moment when somebody has bronchitis in your office. And I can think of an instance recently at my office where a woman was walking along the hallway coughing. You thought that she was just going to keel over at any moment. And all along the way, what I could hear is, oh gosh, what's going on? What's going on? Do you have a bronchitis? Is it a cold? It could be pneumonia, you know. And then all of a sudden you start to hear the drawers opening and that virtual pharmaceutical company that we have in them begins to come out with the cough drops and a lot of questions. Have you seen a doctor? Have you tried antibiotics? Have you done any of it? And it made me think that what would happen if that very same person had withdrawn, looked sad, perhaps had some red-rimmed eyes, and very quietly was walking by us, even in a behavioral health company. What is it that we would encounter with that? I can see by what you're saying, your faces are going, nothing, right? And as one of my colleagues in HR at Merrill said, no, I don't think I'd approach that. Although, you know, the other day I did ask a guy who was limping, you know, what happened to you got a hitch in your giddy up, what happened? Now, I don't know why a New Yorker would use hitch in your giddy up, but who am I to question his terminology? So we do feel very free, don't we, when it comes to physical illness. precluding depression is part of that, number one, but also precluding it from the conversation in any realm of the conversation. So, the other piece that's interesting is that 49% felt that they couldn't tell their manager about their depression because it would place their job at risk. And you probably all have ideas about why that would occur. But part of it goes with the myths and the misperceptions that we have about depression. That there's something characterologically wrong with an individual who suffers from depression. That perhaps they're perceived as somebody who will chronically have this disease. And that's not to say that employees don't withhold information about other chronic diseases, because within the world of employment, there is a level of risk. If you're seen as somebody who's going to need time, need accommodation, need whatever it is that may be outside the realm of, quote, the normal population. And then as a result of the depression, and this may go back to what you were thinking about with yourself, right? For the days that you haven't brought your whole game to work, that you may have had difficulty concentrating, and you may have been forgetful and indecisive, and that the cognitive abilities of the individual with depression definitely are challenged. And what is it that we need in a service economy in order to succeed? Well, we need those cognitive abilities. So you look at it, and depression really is very high impact in very many ways. So first is engagement. And let's face it, in engagement, we aren't doing that great anyways. Gallup finds that about 1 in 5 individuals on the job are highly engaged. But what also Gallup found was those individuals who are highly engaged had better health and mental health, better physical and mental health than the others too. They took better care of themselves and experienced better health and physical health. And that level of healthiness, whole healthiness, allowed them to engage. Now, obviously, there are a lot of factors, right? There's culture, there's all kinds, there's who your manager is and how your manager responds to you. But there are some basic groundwork principles that we could work on here that essentially would allow people, if we could create a culture of openness, if we could create a culture of health and total health, that might allow people to feel more engaged in their work. Productivity, I think that that's a given, but when you think about some of the side effects of depression, you can also understand it. Most people have some level of sleep problems when they're depressed, whether it's needing too much, showing up late, or whether they can't get enough and showing up exhausted. They may have difficulties with anxiety. Anxiety is very significant and is highly significant in the co-occurrence with depression. And so depression also has co-occurrence with many other illnesses. So if we went over to disability, we can't just measure depression by what the disabling condition of depression is. We have to also look at perhaps other conditions. And what's been interesting is more recent research, and I would say that we're pretty much in the infancy of all of this. When you think about depression as a brain-based disorder, we're in the infancy. When you think about the bidirectional relationships of depression with things like arthritis, cardiovascular disease, stroke, Parkinson's, and a whole variety of other illnesses, then we start to maybe listen. Because at that point, when companies think about what they're spending on these other health conditions, and when we begin to think about this bidirectional relationship, not only do we look at disability differently, we look at depression differently. And so education on this is going to be key, and keeping up with the research on this will be key as well. Retention. So if you go back to your moments of, again, when you weren't feeling so great on the job, and perhaps somebody notices, and if you think of a person who continuously tries, gets there, but the presenteeism is part of this process, there's some performance issues, oftentimes people will go ahead and take a disability leave based on the fact that they're fearful about performance. They may not need the disability leave, maybe they need the accommodation, but the accommodation means telling a bit of the story. And that's where the risk comes in, and that's where the cultural safety comes in. And if they choose to go ahead and get the accommodation, then it's living with the knowledge that there's something different about what they're doing compared to their peers and feeling that one off. Again, the culture can either support or not support that in a way. And so it becomes perhaps a point of embarrassment. It becomes perhaps a point of risk where people perhaps make their own decision to leave a company for that, quote, fresh start somewhere else where they don't have that labeling going along with them. And then loss of life. And I think we touched that pretty clearly, that people are highly impacted by that. And it doesn't even necessarily mean the people that have the closest relationships. I can recall going into one of the branch offices of Merrill where a person completed suicide, and it was a receptionist who was relatively new. She had been there for about 3 months. And what she said was, I didn't know him. We never really had a big conversation, but he was part of my morning every single morning. And he demonstrated such a kindness to me and asked me how I was, and he seemed genuinely interested in how I was. So it doesn't have to be a significant event or relationship over the course of years. It impacts all of us. So we have been reluctant and remiss in addressing this, in opening up the conversation. And if you think about it, it's not unusual, it wouldn't be unthinkable to say why. I mean, when you think about business, business doesn't necessarily want to be associated with mental illness. Most businesses aren't going to say, oh, please, we've got probably 25% of our people who are just mentally ill. That's how our employees are. Well, the reality is that that probably is not a bad number. You know, that they experience it one time or another. But I think in the opening remarks, we talked about recovery. And that's the piece that we keep forgetting to put in the conversation, that people can and do recover from mental illness. So we have been reluctant, and we really need to rethink how it is that we introduce this conversation in a way that benefits the business, that benefits the employees, that benefits everybody who's attending to this within the human resource departments, within benefits, within all of those arenas, that this needs to be a total health approach, and not just in language, but in behaviors. So we want to take a look at what that means, and we also have to challenge some of the pre-existing beliefs with this. So for instance, many companies will say, well, we don't have that issue here. We hire the brightest and the best. We're good. Some companies will say, well, we have an EAP, the utilization is about 4%. So I think that really demonstrates that we're a pretty healthy company. And when you look at our 4% and break that down, a lot of that's marital stuff, relationship issues, so it's not really mental illness. But EAPs suffer from the same type of stigma that mental illness does. All you have to do is go to a health fair. And if you have an EAP booth there, next to the health and fitness booth and the gym and everybody else, oftentimes what you'll see are people will stop at every booth, they see the EAP, they smile and move on. When I was at Merrill, we had a pretty robust internal EAP that was fairly widely accepted, had great utilization. So while everybody else gave away M&Ms and pens, you know what I was raffling off? iPads. iPads. My budget for a health fair always was pretty significant at Merrill Lynch. So that, I think that there's all you have to do is maybe go to the health fair and watch, and then you begin to get a sense of where this conversation needs to go, just based on what their willingness to walk up to a table that actually says Employee Assistance Program on it. So we want to get there, don't we? Particularly when there's this disproportionate sense that when you think about with the diagnosis of depression, the 7 out of 10 of those individuals diagnosed are in the workplace. This is a very costly issue. The minimum amount that I've seen is about $23 billion based on simply absenteeism from Gallup. And then you can look at it's hard to measure this, right? Because there are incalculable costs that come along with this too. There are issues with morale, there are issues with what is it that you lose that you don't even know you've lost? Because somebody who's been a creative, influential, productive force on your team loses their way for a while. We don't know what we've lost in those moments either. So we really don't have a very good arm hold around this idea of cost and depression in the workplace. But it's significant. And it's significant not only in dollars, which oftentimes is the way business will take a look at this, but it's significant in terms of the people that we have. From my vantage point and my bias, we have a responsibility. We have an obligation to care about the people who work for us, to care about all of them. And that's not to say, and Marcy and I were having a conversation last night, it doesn't mean we're a therapeutic community. We aren't turning it into that. We're a business that has real concern and empathy and sensitivity for its individuals, because we understand their value. We understand what it is that they bring to this experience. I'm going to have to check my time. How am I doing? Oh my gosh. All right, so let's move on, shall we? So what is it? This is the clinical definition, lasts at least 2 weeks. It affects emotion, thinking, behavior, physical well-being. Any clinicians in this room? Show of hands. All right, so some of you already know this. The ability to work and have satisfying relationships. That's the key piece of this for the workplace. And how is it that it shows up? And what I want you to think about, and this is why I took you through that initial exercise, what I want you to think about is what it is that we see when you look at that bottom, the self-criticism, which actually could be allowed and verbal, forgetfulness, disorganized, indecisive, personality changes, changes in self-care and appearance, irritability, profound sadness. All of those, when they show up at the workplace, they can actually be much more mimicking of performance issues than people really recognizing that it's depression, that we have something else that we're working with here. There's not a sense of, well, the performance may have a level of deterioration. The question is what's underneath that? What can we get to? What can we get to proactively as opposed to reactively? And if we take note of that person walking through that may have the red eyes, that may seem sad, that may be more withdrawn, that hasn't gone to lunch with us recently, if we can take note and we can take action, then maybe we can deal with a concern when it's just that, a concern, as opposed to it being a problem. And to know that what's going on inside is very different than our assumptions about what's going on with that individual. So just to note the idea that we do things differently, I don't know if you can see any of these, but it's like, why don't you try not having the flu? Anybody ever say that to you? Not really, right? But when we come to depression, what do people say? Maybe if you just thought happy thoughts. Maybe if you just got out there and we think that there's these quick fixes that will do it, that there's something that the person isn't doing for themselves. But it's not the stuff that we say to any of these situations here. Food poisoning, you're just not trying hard enough. We don't go there. And so, that's only 23 minutes, I just want you to know. So, stigma. The thing with the workplace, I'm going to point out a couple of them. One is problem child. Second is malingerer. We like to think that people who experience some level of mental illness, depression or otherwise, and use a short-term disability is that they're just trying to get out of work. What they're trying to do is get better. They're trying to get to the point where they can actually come to work and do their job. And I'm not suggesting that disability is the answer, because I think that we can get to this far sooner than disability comes about. Not that we would eliminate it, but we can get there far sooner. And then the other one is dangerous. And that makes the conversation hard too, particularly with the way the media portrays mental illness, particularly with the idea that if you have mental illness, that puts you in a very high-risk category. When the reality is people with mental illness are far more likely to be the victim of a crime than the perpetrator of a crime. Now, we've had some heinous events out there, and on occasion there has been a mental illness issue involved. But if you go back and you look at the behaviors well beforehand, oftentimes there are points of entry, and if we could open up the conversation, maybe we could use that point of entry. So how do we create a total health safety net? Well, we have to begin this dialogue. Your being here is beginning the dialogue. We have to begin the dialogue whether you're in a health setting or you're in a corporate setting or you're in any type of setting. The dialogue has to begin. And it has to begin now. And I think we've got a recognition that This is a costly problem in all kinds of ways. And if this were a business line or a product, we'd retool it or pull it. We would not tolerate this experience. And so we have to wonder, why are we tolerating this experience right now? So we want to look at what it is you offer your employees. And many companies will say, listen, we do lunchtime seminars, we have EAP, we have My Strengths, we have all kinds of things. We'll test drive them. What does that really mean that you have these? What is it like to pick up that phone and call the EAP? Where does that lead a person? Where does that lead you? When there's a lunchtime seminar you're too busy to attend, get there. Be present. Show your leadership. Show it's safe to be there. And start to measure your attendance between those seminars that deal with mental illness and those workshops that deal with other topics. And you start to see the disparity. You want to raise that. You want to get some equality in there. We want to begin from the top down, the bottom up, and meet at middle. Senior leadership not only needs to be able to talk about this, to have the conversation about this, but to model the behaviors about this. Perhaps, ideally, in this world, to share their own experiences, because they're there, would you say? Senior management most definitely has experiences. And what I found in training with mental health first aid, when I have a mixture of senior leadership and other employees in the room, when they share a story, it changes the whole dynamic. It allows people to speak freely. It allows people to feel accepted. If we want to be a diverse company, then we have to accept all of diversity. We can't make exclusions. We need to bring people in. We need to create a safety net for them. And then if you go down to the bottom, our line level employees is getting them some mental health literacy, allowing them to be their own best advocates, allowing them to take note of how to intercede, how to make a step toward their fellow employees, because who sees this first? It's not the managers, it's the person you're sitting next to. And we're fearful about empowering people in that way. But we're not talking about them diagnosing, we're not talking about them taking them someplace for help, although that happens. In my private practice, I used to see that, employees bringing employees. And what a gift that was, that somebody noticed. Because social support in the workplace is key to a person's recovery. We want to get to the middle and middle management and being able, so when you have a message from the top down, when you have people who are empowered from the bottom up, and then you talk to your middle managers and you train your middle managers and you allow them to notice and address something before it becomes a performance issue, then we've made some impact here. Then we've made a difference, not only in individual lives, but in a team, in a company. We want to reduce the stigma of mental health by having the conversation. We want to increase mental health literacy, because when people, knowledge indeed is power. It's not the power to diagnose, it's maybe the power to acknowledge your own mental health, your own sense of how you're doing when you need to seek out some level of care and treatment for yourself. And it empowers your most valuable resource, your people, because they really can make a difference if you're willing to go there with them. Partner with your benefits providers, start to get creative, and I think with the panel you'll find a lot of creativity here, and keep the conversation going, because by changing our mindset, we can indeed create a psychological safety net for our people. And then I want to give you Elgie, who is our mental health first aid bear. Well, he's not a bear, he's a koala. He's a marsupial, and he's very sensitive about that bear phrase, but I like to throw it out there just to get him going. So mental health first aid is a mental health literacy program. It's an evidence-based program. It's one that can support employees, it can support managers, and HR, security, whomever. It can be segmented, it can be the whole group. It's one of the ways that you can get the conversation going at a grassroots level. Thank you very much.